Japanese prints are a great way to think about cultural diffusion. So in Japan during the Edo period, you have a very powerful leadership in the name of the Tokugawa shogunate. So they basically ruled with an iron fist for a couple hundred years, from 1615 to 1868. And during that time, one of their biggest things was they did not want anyone to take over, as you often have with rulers. And so they destabilized the communities by requiring aristocrats to spend half the year basically in what we now call Tokyo, or the city of Edo. And so these people would be traveling back and forth from their home provinces to Edo, back and forth every year, with a whole lot of servants and family and everybody else. And so in that time, they were often traveling, and they would get to Edo, and there was these artists who were working largely in Edo, these printmakers, and they would make prints of things like Mount Fuji, or the different trips, the different toll booths on the Tokaido Road, which was one of the major roads that would take you from Tokyo to wherever you were from. So if you think about like postcards at the turnpike, that's what this is kind of like. So those prints were very popular, and they were like pretty affordable, so you could collect them. They were around the range of a bowl of noodles or 2 bowls of noodles. They were just cheap keepsakes on some level. And so they were just things that we had a lot of. That's important because there was a lot of them made, particularly in the 1800s. So people are making prints, so many prints, huge market of these guys living in Edo buying souvenirs. Great, perfect. Well, what happens is, for these printmakers, a couple of really interesting things. One of them is they get their hands on Dutch prints, and they start seeing something called perspective, where the Dutch artists are depicting space, 3D space, on a 2D surface. And so this makes these Japanese printmakers very excited. Now, they did get much less news from the outside world because the Tokugawa shogunate not only wanted to destabilize the power of the aristocrats, they also wanted to ensure that nobody got any ideas about, coup d'etats and stuff. And so they had a very locked down culture. Very little of the outside world came in, but there were Dutch traders, and things did come in, but just in a very, very small amount of things. And so they learn about, 1, perspective, and then 2, another big thing comes in. They get new blue pigments, and blue is a very exciting pigment for them because people love the color. Like, that's one global truth. People just love the color blue. So they get this new kind of blue, they get this new kind of way of depicting the world, and then they push their printmaking very far as a result. And so they have things like, one of the big things that they make prints of is actors and theater. And it's actually like today, right? How much pop culture media do we have? It's the same thing. So they're making these pop culture prints of actors in the theater, and this is, you can see it is 1 point perspective, right? Like, it looks like it, and it makes it more exciting for the person who bought this souvenir. It makes them feel like they were there. It shows how busy it was and how many people are hanging out. The other thing you get is lots of images that show a lot of blue, and of course the Great Wave at Kanagawa is one of those ones that has so much blue in it. So that's cultural diffusion into Japan. Japan also really impacts European art. And while not very many things were going into Japan, lots of things were going out. Japan had a real thriving trade economy of sending things out, ceramics, prints, and both of those really impacted artists, particularly in America and in France, but really all over the world. There was, first of all, a whole style called Japonisme, which was French artists largely, and most of them were working in decorative art. So they were making jewelry, ceramics, furniture, and they wanted it to look sort of Japanese. They were really taken by the asymmetry in Japanese art, but also how everything was sort of like graphic design. Everything was very simple forms, clear colors. They weren't trying to make it look realistic. They were trying to make it look stylized in Japanese art. And so the French artists became really excited about that. But the other group of people that became very excited about that were painters. People like Vincent van Gogh, who was a collector of Japanese prints. They cost more than a bowl of noodles in France, but they still were affordable collectibles. He definitely had some, and the people in his circle had them as well. And so what he was really taken by, again, was the blue. He was really taken by how the colors were simple, how there was a real use of blue leaning into that in many of his artworks. But he was also really taken by how they depicted motion. And, you look at the Great Wave and how the motion of the wave is depicted. You can sort of imagine it about to crash, right? Because the boat is there and you can see this motion even though it's a still image. He was also very much taken by the culture of Japan and kimonos and imagining what it would be like to be Japanese, and other people too. Lots of people took up the fad of wearing kimonos around the house. But in general, the biggest thing about what sort of translated, because Vincent van Gogh was interested in it, but other artists definitely saw this, was this idea that you do not have to be slavishly connected to realism or symmetry or rules, because they didn't see, even though those artists were working within Japanese rules, for the French artists, that was saying, oh, there's different rules. If there's different rules, that means none of the rules matter. All of the rules could be broken. And so you see that even more than a direct one-to-one of style, you see this idea that you could try asymmetry. And a good example of that is Mount Saint-Victoire by Cézanne is fairly symmetrical, not as symmetrical perhaps as Fuji, but pretty symmetrical. And when you look at the prints of Fuji, you see they were purposefully asymmetrical. And that Cézanne takes that up. Even though this doesn't look very Japanese in its coloration or its style, the use of asymmetry absolutely is because he had been looking at Japanese prints. So there you see cultural diffusion first from Europe to Japan, and then from Japan to France.